This is a recording of Ann Tabor talking about Alpena's history. Recorded February 5th, 1978.
Doing there, Herman? Somebody said they couldn't hear me in the back. That'll be the day. You want, huh? Oh, you want to take a little tour? Hi, Herman. How are you? Herman's recording all of this for posterity, which is so but he's got this machine back there. He loves to play with it. So, hey, Mike, Mrs. McKim brought me the, this is going to be painful, kids, Lake Huron Shore reprint from 1883. I hope some of the rest of you have this book. I meant to get it, one of those things. What was it, $15 or something in the reprint? Mike, where'd you go? They reprinted it because there are very limited copies of this job available, the real one, the old one, you know. And they're going for pretty high prices. Bob, weren't you the one that told me that?
$50 was the last price
that you
on
heard
the
it.
original, and it was not in good condition.
Yeah. So I think it's marvelous they've reprinted it, and I, of course, didn't get one when I should have.
I think it was $18.
Something like that. Mike said I could have this one. Okay, Herman, I'm ready if you are, as ready as I'll ever be, I guess. I'm sorry about the voice. It comes from, I'm a school teacher. Junior high age. I shouldn't have to say any more than that when it comes to why I've lost my voice. But we were just starting a new batch of kids Thursday, the new semester. So I acquired, about 125 new little cans of worms and worked so very hard for the first 2 days trying to get them all revved up for Alpena history, you know. And had suggestions of some of the stories that we will be covering, some of the things they can. I make them a promise that they can hit me for one astounding fact every day. That holds for about 3 weeks, you know. That's about as many astounding facts as I've got, really, and then they kind of forget about it, that they can take home and be the stars of the dinner table with. I was going to last time, and I think I will next time, bring my final exam from Alpena history, just to see how many of you would be able to answer the questions. Where's Trowbridge Point? What's on it now? Which one is George Washington Bridge? What's Victoria Square and Jessie Square, and what were they named for? These are the things that, Kevin, can you answer that? Do you know where which is George Washington Bridge? Which is Victoria Square? Shut up, Langus, you're a teacher. Now you should know which. Well, I think I will bring that. Kevin sat through my Alpena history twice, once as a student and once as a student helper, so he should be well inundated with it. At any rate, in my effort to get the children all revved up, as I say, it kind of shot my voice, so I hope it won't be too painful for you. It's painful for me, and one of us is enough to suffer. As I told the people who were here last time, and I think that included quite a few of you, in spite of the terrible blizzard, the weather we had to go through last weekend, and so many of you dear souls came anyhow, for which I was very grateful. I'm not an orthodox historian and never will be. Deliver me from such. I think that history can be sugar-coated, and that you can get the historical facts that you need. Not that I think there's anything so world-shattering about Alpena's history that it bears memorizing. At least that's what I tell my kids. You can always look it up if you need to know, you know, a date or whatever. So I'm great at, sometime in the early 80s, you know. That is mostly, as I said last week, defensive, because I can't remember my own phone number, let alone a date. And I don't think it's really all that important. And if you tell the stories of the people who lived here, the early people, stories that you can come across, bit at a time, here and there, and put it all together, it's kind of like detective work. You'll get a picture of what the town was like, and the facts will be there if they are important enough to you. But the picture of what the town was like, and the people who started it, who worked so hard to give us a town that we've got here now, for which I think we should be eternally grateful, because I think it's one of the best towns going. Very different, very unique. There's none other like it in many aspects. And how it got to be that way is the sum total of the people who made it. So, as I suggested last week, the little people, I have a terrible fear of throwing that glass on the floor, that the little people that started the town and that came or stayed and kept the town going, and that was a chore. That was a job. The town should have died after the lumber was cut. Those are the people that I would like to see commemorated in the books and on the street signs. It's all right to commemorate the ones with the money and the power, that's fine, but then they're going to get it anyhow. And the little guys that end up out at the end of Washington Avenue and never get remembered, I think, are the ones that are due a lot of the credit too. So I propose a book wherein each chapter would perhaps be about those people. And last week we were dealing with Alpena's biggest loser, Sam Boggs. With a name like that, you had to work twice as hard to be anything, you know. Poor Sam. And in telling Sam's story, more or less, I hoped that some of you got a picture of the town in 1858 when it was first beginning, when Sam first came, and the two great fires of 71 and 72, wherein Sam Boggs burned out both times. That's why he's Alpena's biggest loser, poor old Sam. And how Sam lived through and died at the same time, the same year George N. Fletcher, the proprietor of the town, died in 1899. That you got a picture of the story. If you want me to, you can ask me about the facts. When did it start? What somebody asked last week, what does Alpena mean? I was astounded. I thought everybody knew it meant partridge. Of course, I guess not too many people know it really means half a partridge. As I told you last week, you know, they misnamed it. Somebody wrote down A-L, and it should have been A-W. A-L means land of the partridge. A-W in Chippewa, Alpena, or no, Alpena means partridge. A-L means half a partridge. So your town is named Half a Partridge, which was kind of symbolic because we did things sort of, you know, like they lived on both sides of the river for 7 years before they got around to building a bridge. And they got the logs all cut up river, 2 million feet, some for George Fletcher and some for Lockwood and Minor. And about halfway through the winter, when the logs were being decked on the riverbanks there, they were supposed to be building a mill down in town, and they got half of the mill built. All the wood, they had to import the wood, nothing to saw it with here yet. And they got it framed, got the one mill framed, and halfway up, thing burned. But that's right, they did it again. And then suddenly somebody thought, sheesh, we forgot to build a dam. So they sat there with their thumbs in their mouths, waiting till somebody figured out how to build a dam. In the meantime, Smith and Chamberlain came in and built a steam sawmill. I don't know why that didn't occur to the people who started this town, but it didn't. I don't think they got those first two mills going for, 3-4 years till they figured out how to build a dam, you know. So like I say, half a partridge is perhaps fairly symbolic of the way things were done here early on. Well, today then, let's jazz it up a little. I said last week there were a lot of good guys in this town, the majority of them, I'm sure. But like with every other town that has a history, they all do, not quite as colorful as ours perhaps, there were a few bad guys too. And I think they should deserve some credit. So, how would you go for a book, a chapter in a book that started out something like this? He arrived by boat because everybody in the early 80s had to come by boat. There was no other way to get here that anybody could tolerate. The stagecoach was a wee bit bumpy. They hadn't built the Singing Bridge across the Ausable yet. Well, I guess they had. I guess they got that thing built in the early 1860s, but it was still a pretty treacherous trip by stagecoach. So most everybody came in the summertime when the lake was open by steamship, which was a pretty comfortable way to travel. So they arrived in the early 1880s. Don't ask me when exactly. 83, 84, doesn't matter. Early 1880s. A very strange character. He got off the boat, and I'm sure the townspeople all were agog because he was wearing white robes, and he had blonde hair, and it was down past his shoulders. You know, wouldn't upset anybody today, probably. But in 1880, whatever, early 1880s, it was a sort of a weird way to be. He wore sandals. He had a gold rope around his waist. He looked like Jesus. Indeed, he said that's what he was, the reincarnation of the Christ. His name was not very Christ-like. George Jacob Swineforth was his name. And he had come here, ostensibly, we're not sure, but he had come to Alpena to visit some relatives of a Mrs. Beekman. Dora Beekman, well, it goes back quite a ways, back to the Mormon movement, when the Mormons split up, and there were many offshoots of the Mormon religion, and some of them were not Mormon religious people. I don't mean to infer anything about the Mormon religion, for heaven's sakes, But when it was split up, some people took advantage of the situation to start their own religious cults, and they were strictly con games, really. Nothing based on the true religion, the only really American religion we've got, you know, the Mormon religion, the only one that started here, of the old ones, that is. Mrs. Beekman was one of these people who had left the Mormon movement at that time and started her own little outfit. And through the years, those first few years, there rose as her right-hand bower this George Jacob Swineforth. Came up through the ranks, so to speak, to stand at Mrs. Beekman's right hand. They were centered in Rockford, Illinois. And apparently Mrs. Beekman had relatives here in Alpena. Who they were, I don't know. There was a Beckman family here. Perhaps there was a misspelling. That often happened with the old families, you know. It'll give you fits if you try to trace your own genealogy. Your ancestors kept changing their names, and the spellings got, you know, everything was handwritten, and some people didn't write so good. So names would get changed. Perhaps it was the Beckman family, I don't know. At any rate, Mrs. Beekman, Dora Beekman, had died out in Illinois, and that put George Jacob in power. And so he came here to visit, apparently, these relatives of Mrs. Beekman's. And while he was here, he did a little preaching on a street corner or two, and found that Alpena was ripe for picking. People had long, cold winters, not a heck of a lot else to do, you know, so people were very anxious. Maybe it was just because he was so freaky looking, but they stood around and they listened to him, and he stayed, and got quite a few people convinced. In fact, he was making a pretty good amount of money off of contributions from our local people who should have known better but didn't. It wasn't that we didn't have enough churches of our own, heaven knows. It's always been a real churchy town, you know. But he convinced enough people, one of whom was the wife of a very affluent lumberman. This lady was just so enamored of George Jacob, she convinced her husband to build him a church. And so he did. He built a nice, neat, little white church. And George Jacob moved into it. He called it heaven. That was his heaven. He had it well stocked with live-in angels before you knew it. Some of the prettiest and youngest girls in the town. It got to be a scandal of great proportions. Heaven it was. George Jacob Swineforth held forth in his white robes and was making money like you wouldn't believe, and just living a good life, as you can well imagine. Finally, the city fathers, or at least the fathers of the angels, started questioning what this fellow was all about. Took him a while to catch on. And the word got back to George. There was talk of lynching, talk of tar and feathering, and the word got back to the Reverend Swineforth, who was of the perfectionist faith. That's what he called his church, the perfectionists. The word got back to him that there was a little unrest in the town and that maybe the climate wasn't going to be too healthy for him here very much longer. So he left town quickly. By this time he had a fair-sized boat down in the river, pretty good-looking yacht, and he took off on that. And a good thing, because the city fathers had decided that if he indeed was the reincarnation of the Christ, he would have no trouble walking on water, and they were about to propose that he do just that. He took 3 of his local angels with him, and was next heard of in Chicago, where he established his church there and was doing the same act there with the angels and the whole bit, including 3 from Alpena, whose fathers went after them in short order, and 2 of them were brought back here. But one of them stayed, and she was eventually George Jacob's undoing. She escaped. Nobody ever got out of heaven to testify against him, and Chicago was up in arms about him too. And they couldn't get anybody to testify as to what he'd done. One of the angels, the one from Alpena that was left, I think this was about 1895 by now, had gotten away, had taken a job as a clerk in the store in Chicago. George Jacob sent a male angel after her. He was apprehended by the police. The girl went to the police then and told all, and I think that was the end of George Jacob Swineforth. Meantime, he had come back here once or twice in about 1889 to visit. He still had faithful here. They came to Chicago to see him now and again, can you imagine, from Alpena, and made contributions to his cause and so forth. But he found that the money wasn't, he didn't make it worth his while to make the trip, even though by then he could do it by train, because of course we got the railroad in 1886. So George Jacob Swineforth fades into history, but not his heaven. The lumberman who had built it then found himself in possession of it again after George Jacobs' hasty departure from our city, and didn't know what to do with it. And so I don't know whether he gave it, some of you might know, gave it or whether it was bought by the Jewish community. And so heaven is on White Street. It's Temple Bethel today, same building. Then there's another chapter that we could take up, and this is one of my favorite areas. There was a fellow, well, a long time ago, when I was doing a radio program connected with, well, it turned out to be mostly Alpena history. Some of you might remember, it was long a time ago, early 1950s, I think. The last script I think I have is 1955. When I was doing a few of the earlier programs on history, having just discovered that the town had a history that was worth going into, having just arrived here to live, Frank Garvey, you remember Frank, the newspaper? Well, Frances Garvey with the cigarette hanging outside of her mouth. There was a newspaper woman. Called me one day and says, well, if you're so gung-ho on doing Alpena history, why don't you find out about Paulette Cicero? There was a real character in this town. So I started asking around, and you couldn't find too many stories because Paulette Cicero is legendary. I sometimes wonder if he existed. Oh, yes, he did, because I have found stories about him, actually found them in the newspapers of the 1870s. So I know there was such a person. Paulette Cicero, I liken to Paul Bunyan. He's our own Paul Bunyan. Every Northwoods town had to have one, and we had Paulette. Perhaps he wasn't quite as, I've never heard any really bad stories about the original Paul Bunyan, and about Paulette Cicero we can't say the same. Paulette Cicero was a jobber for Harrington Jenny. That was the mill that was down about where the Ford Garage is now, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe 4th Street, maybe the foot of 4th Street. Paulette lived, he had a little farm, and his house was right about where First Federal Savings is now. And he had about that half a block in there for his farm. Just a little place, a barn, and, big garden, I suppose it would be more or less today. But he lived there. The house is still in existence, I understand. It was moved much later, and I remember that's 1870s, early 1870s when Paulette lived there. It was moved to the corner of 3rd and White Street, McGurn House. There's a brown shingled house on the corner, and if you look at the foundation, you'll see that it's a very old house. You know how you can tell old houses in this town. Look at the foundations. The hand-hewn blocks of limestone in the foundations will tell you approximately how old they are. Cement didn't start here till 1899, and I don't think they started making blocks for a few years. So any store-bought block had to be after the turn of the century. Anything with the hand-hewn blocks has to be before that time. Well, at any rate, Paulette Cicero was a legendary character around here. He was real. But the stories as they've come down, and I could never find any really written out. Oh, I found references in the newspaper, as I said, but not the true story of what would happen on those evenings when Paulette ended up in the local hoosegow, which he didn't do too often because they wouldn't hold him. Just out with the bars. Must tell you about the jails. The only authority that he recognized was Town Marshal Doug Scott. Now, he could have made mincemeat out of Doug Scott in short order, but he had great respect either for the man himself or for the office, for the badge, and he always did pretty much what Doug Scott told him to do. Doug was the only one that could calm him down. Paulette, it turned out, in my research, was really a dual personality. He was a gentle, kind soul who loved children. Just as nice a person as you'd ever hope to meet when he was sober. When he was drinking, wow, it was women and children off the streets, And it got so in latter years. He died in 1878. Toward the latter years, he was drunk more than he was sober because he was in trouble pretty much constantly, I guess. Just one of those mean drunks, I guess, At any rate, I got a first-hand story about Paulette Cicero from an old fella that lived out in Lachine, Long Rapids. Back in those early radio days of mine, I ran a sort of a contest to see who was the oldest living person, I didn't want any dead ones, the oldest living person who was born in Alpena. And thereby got a lot of names of people I could go talk to, you know. And the oldest one was old Clint Mortimer. He's about that high. His wife was about that high. I think they shrank. Cutest little couple you ever saw in your life. Very old. And they were in their 90s. And I went out to talk to Clinton. I had to go about 3 different times because I wore him out, you know. He could only talk for a while, and then you could see he was gone. His mind would wander off. And I'd have to, well, okay, Annie, I'll be back. I was his wife. I'll be back another day. And I'd go back. But eventually I got from him all that I thought he could tell me. Those were the days before tape recorders, incidentally, so I didn't get it recorded, but I took voluminous notes. And I asked Clint on one of those interviews, do you remember Paulette Cicero? Oh, yes, yes. You can just see his little old eyes light up. Yes, I remember. He was our friend. Well, now, Clinton was born in Alpena in 1860. There I go again. 68, I believe. Over on Lockwood Street, around 8th and Lockwood, 8th, and in that block between Lockwood and Chisholm on 8th Street. His dad was carpenter by trade and also the local coffin maker. Kept a few pine boxes in the back room, you know, just to have. And then the smallpox epidemic hit in 1872, and he got so frustrated trying to keep up. 50 people died in a very short time. He got frustrated trying to keep up making pine boxes that he gave the business up altogether. It was just too depressing, Clint said. But Clint used to go to school at Central School, Union School, the one that's where Thunder Bay is now. That was always school there, you know, from very, very early, the early 1860s. It was school from then on. The famous old stone school that some of you remember very well, I'm sure, especially that glorious day and night in 1940 when it burned. Fred said, my husband said everybody went threw their books in. True? Don't know. And then they built the one that's there now, Alpena High School, and now Thunder Bay. At any rate, he went to school there, Clint did, so to go home over on Lockwood and 8th, he had to go, they always made it a point, the little kids did who went that way, to go right through Paulette Cicero's backyard. And if Paulette was around, which he often was, he would always stop and play with them, ride him around on his shoulders, put him on his horse and ride them around the barnyard. They dearly loved him. Another Paulette, a different person altogether than the one that we meet in the legend. Clint said he remembered so well the day that Paulette died. It was in September, school had started, and the word got over, as it always does in Alpena, very rapidly to the school that Paulette Cicero had died, and the little kids all felt so terrible. So on their way home that night, a bunch of them stopped at the door of the house there where First Federal Savings is and knocked, and Miss Cicero came to the door. Paulette, he had 2 wives. By his first wife, he had a son, and by his second wife, when he died, the second wife, he had 2 daughters. Miss Cicero came to the door, and they said they came to pay their respects, and so she let them go upstairs to the front bedroom where Paulette was laid out on this great big old bed. I don't suppose it was bigger than most people's beds, but to a little kid, it must have seemed very large. And Clinton said that's one memory he had kept all his life, was standing down at the foot of that humongous bed, little face looking up between those 2 great big cock boots at that gentle face that he had known so well. Yes, he remembered Paulette Cicero, but that wasn't the story I had come for. I wanted to hear about Paulette the rowdy, Paulette the fighter, Paulette the man that nobody ever licked. Nobody, including Silver Jack of Saginaw, though he had his chance. Paulette Cicero then was our Paul Bunyan, and I think he should be remembered. Oh, the stories there are several of them, none of which I can document, and I'm sure they've grown and changed in the telling over the years. I haven't changed any of them. I never do that. But some of them go like this. Paulette, one night, was leaving his house, picture at First Federal, going down past the penny store. You know, that's what they're today. Turning the corner, stopping off at one of his local watering spots. Saloon, every other swinging door, you know, all the way down the street. And when he was in there, somebody came in and said, hey, there's something going on down Chisholm Street. They're moving a house. Somebody's stealing a house. It was, you know, the middle of the night. They got this house halfway out in the middle. Well, that's all Paulette needed to know. You know, every night, big fight. If he couldn't get in on somebody else's, he'd start his own. Well, that sounded like something he should take care of. So he went rolling down Chisholm Street, and sure enough, right down there where the Quality House Furniture building, the old Fraser Products building is, there was a house being a whole bunch of guys. Big burly old guys moving a house off the lot right into the middle of the street. Well, Paulette should have stopped and asked why. That property belonged to Mr. Lockwood, right on down to the river. They had kept the mill rights. Mr. Lockwood was one of the early proprietors of the town. Fletcher bought it along with Lockwood, Oldfield, and Minor. And they retained the river rights on both sides, of course, for their milling. Well, this was 1870s. It was obvious that the Chisholm Street property wasn't going to be necessary to the mill rights. River Street would take care of it. Good old crooked River Street, remember? And so Mr. Lockwood had agreed to sell the property there, I don't know how much of it, to Mr. Churchill, another early lumberman. But on the property was a house. And the house belonged to Captain Jim Reed, famous Great Lakes captain who had quartered out of here. I don't know, I guess Mr. Lockwood just let Captain Reed build a house there and, sort of like squatters' privileges, wasn't bothering anybody. But now the property was being sold, and if Captain Reed didn't get his house off, it was going to be sold to Churchill with the property. And Captain Reed had been out on his boat, just got into town. That afternoon, Lockwood said, you better get that house off or it's going to go. Midnight, the sale is finalized. So Captain Reed took all of his deckhands, all these big sailors, and went down and they were moving the house out to get it into the middle of the street before the property sale was final. So that was what Paulette should have found out about. Not him, boy. Lockwood was a friend of his. He used to work for him. By gosh, nobody's going to steal his house if he had anything to say about it. He cleaned the whole pack of them. They were all right out in the middle of old sawdust Chisholm Street, flat on their backs, and Paulette, back to the bar. Well, they caught him that time. They hauled him in. As I say, they didn't haul him in unless they could help it. If they could help it, they tried to find a different way to reason with him, because the jail was just made out of wood, and if he chose not to stay, that was it. He wouldn't stay. Neither would the bars and the windows. So they did arrest him with assault with intent to murder. And they fined him $200. Well, that was a lot of money in those days. Fellas were working for $1 a day and less, so $200 is that's 2/3 of a year's pay. Well, closer to half, I guess, of a year's pay. Well, anyhow, I don't know whether they ever paid the money or not, but it is the second entry, that arrest, the second entry in the oldest court record book we have. So I know that's bona fide, you see. Those old handwritten records. We had records before that, but they all burned, like everything else in this town's burned once or twice anyhow. So I wonder if we've got anything left at all, really. Well, that didn't slow Paulette down, that being arrested and stuff. That didn't slow him down at all. Paulette was a good Catholic. St. Anne's, of course, French church. They didn't call them St. Anne's and St. Bernard's and St. Mary's. You went to the Irish church or the French church or the Polish church. Didn't matter that you were Catholic. They didn't call them Catholic churches. They just called them by nationality. Another facet of Alpena, which has made it what it is, the polarization of nationality groups in this town, which is no more. We're pretty well mixed up now, I guess, but for a long, long time, the Polish people stayed where they were, and the German people stayed out in Wilson Township, and the Norwegians and Swedes stayed in Lear. And the Scottish people were right between them and the main road there at Long Rapids. Did you know? Here I go. I never can stay on a subject. Did you know that this snow reminds me of it too? And talking about Lear, yeah, there's a whole bunch of Norwegians and Swedes up in Lear. Just look at the map. All the roads, Anger, all the roads are named Swedish names. You come down about a half a mile, and all the roads are suddenly Scotch. MacArthur, McDougall, because Long Rapids and its only church was a Scotch Presbyterian. And the only church in Lear was a Lutheran for the Norwegians. The Norwegians got here, and the snows were up to your navel, and they had to get into town for supplies. That didn't bother the Norwegians at all. They just strapped on the old cross-country skis, and away they went, right through Long Rapids, and all the Scotchmen standing there looking at them saying, well, that's neat. Why can't we do that? And it was the only thing that got the two communities together. The Scotsmen had to come off their high horse and plead with the Norwegians, please, will you make us some cross-country skis so we can go to town, too? So the two communities sort of developed this little brotherhood, and they weren't enemies anymore. But before that, they hadn't had much to do with each other. And, of course, none of them were speaking to the Germans over in Wilson Township. I don't know how they got to town. They probably didn't need to. A very self-sufficient group. Anyhow, back to Paulette. Paulette was a Frenchman, and therefore Catholic, and therefore St. Anne's was his parish. One night, one night in a bar, or rather right outside of a bar, well, in the bar there had been a fight. Let's see, it was Rory McLeod taking on McDonald, I believe it was, McDonald from Greenbush. I don't know what the argument was. They didn't need much of an excuse in those days, before the glasses and chairs started flying, and the bartender was plastering himself against the beautiful picture and mirror trying to protect it. It was a nightly occurrence in little old Alpena, quiet lumber town of the North Woods. Out on the street came the brawlers, probably got helped by the bartender, the owner of the saloon, and they continued their fight out there. Paulette saw that, oh boy, here we go again. And he looked at him and let's see, I don't know that McDonald character, but this other fellow's a friend of mine, and so he proceeded to take care of him. Got himself arrested again for that. But it was a Saturday night, and Father Taken at the Catholic Church heard about it and said, well, enough is enough. We have had it with this Cicero person. We are not going to allow him in our church again. I don't know what happened to forgiveness, but I guess they had just been stretched too far at St. Anne's. So Father Taken went down and spiked up Paulette's slip. The pew, the one you paid for, the one you rented, kept. That was yours. Father Taken put spikes up, or got the altar boys to, I don't know, put spikes up both sides of the slip so that nobody could get in. Well, the next morning, Paulette, having shaken off his hangover, came down to St. Anne's, as was his custom, and he was a little late, and proceeded to go into the church to take his rightful place in his slip. And the whole congregation was sitting there holding its breath, wondering what is going to happen when Paulette discovers what Father has done. Because, they liked their church. They hated to see it torn apart. Paulette was thoroughly capable of it. But no, now there are two versions of most of these stories. Two versions. One is that he came down, took a look at it, and just calmly unbent them and went in and sat down, and the Mass went on. The other one, and I like it better, is that he looked at it and cogitated for a moment or two, turned around, walked back up the aisle, squawk, squawk, cock boots, squeaky old things, and everybody sitting there, holding their breath, wondering what's going to happen now. Went back to the Father's sitting room where he waits for the congregation to gather, picked up a rocking chair, put it up over his head, walked down the slip, down to his slip, down the aisle again, squawk, 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 set the rocking chair down in the middle of the aisle and rocked, squeak, squeak, his way through the whole Mass. Father Taken just simply heaved a sigh of relief, having now regretted what he had done in the first place, and went on with the Mass, and that was the end of that. And they unspiked Paulette's pew, and it was never spiked again. And he never missed church, and he was a good giver to the church, too. Then there was the Silver Jack of Saginaw episode. Silver Jack, for those of you uninitiated, was a lumberjack to be conjured with, I'll tell you. He was from Saginaw, and they've written books about him, and I know he existed. And he was an unbeatable one, too. These were the days before the Marquis of Queensberry rules for boxing. It was bare fists and to the death, and no rounds, no stopping. Fight game was a big one. Professionals, they had them in those days, too. Much money changed hands, but the most fun fights were the ones on the street corner that people kind of put one fella up against another person, and much money changed hands into betting, and the fight was on. We had a lot of those here, too. Well, Silver Jack was such a fighter from Saginaw, and when he wasn't out logging, he was fighting. Well, Cicero had been the terror of this town for just about long enough, and everybody was scared of him, and they couldn't seem to do too much with him to discourage him, and he was getting pretty obstreperous, and so the townspeople thought, well, maybe we can stop him. They had to consider that sober he was a hard-working fella. And we needed hard-working fellas. This was early in our history, and we needed all the strong men we could get. Pretty wild up here, not too many of them coming yet. So they thought, well, now maybe if we could arrange for Paulette Cicero to just get the bejeepers beaten out of him just once, he'd calm him down a little bit. So this one fella said, well, sure, I know just how to do it. Nobody here is going to do it, for sure. So we'll go down and we'll make the proposition to Silver Jack of Saginaw. We'll tell him that we got a fella up here that thinks he can beat him. And see if we can get him to come, promise him part of the purse or whatever, the bets that we're going to go around. And see if we can't set up a fight because we know that Silver Jack can take him. Nobody's ever beaten Silver Jack Saginaw. And so the fight was arranged. Paulette heard about it. They didn't make a big production of telling them ahead of time, so he'd have any time to get prepared. They wanted him to be beaten badly to see if it would humiliate him a little bit into behaving himself a little better. So the day arrived, and so did Silver Jack with the fellow from Alpena who had gone down to get him. The entourage left the boat. Now, they hadn't told Silver Jack who he was fighting, just a Jack from Alpena. You know, and that was all right with him. He'd take on any comers if the money was right, and apparently it was. So they got off the boat, and they started down 2nd Avenue. Well, in the meantime, Paulette had been informed, hey, the guy from Saginaw's here, the one that's going to, take you on. Well, that was great with Paulette, so he came rolling down the street from his little farm there at First Federal Savings, and they met at approximately, we are told, the vicinity of the State Theater. I keep wanting to say Maltz. The Maltz Opry House it was in those days. Well, it wasn't yet, I don't think. I think it was still the Sherman House. Nope, that burned in 1872. Yeah, I think it was probably the Maltz Opera House by then. Don't know what the year was that this fight took place. At any rate, that was the place they met. And the fight was on. And it was 2 versions to this story, too. First one, Silver Jack was doing his job. Paulette was taking a shellacking. Really bad, but he was such a game old fella. And he wasn't too big. He was built like, low center of gravity couldn't knock him over. He was built very broad. He wasn't too terribly tall. Men weren't tall in those days, but powerful. Arms down to the ground, ape-like. And he was fighting a game fight, and he got kind of quiet in the crowd that had gathered. They were starting to feel a little sorry for him. And then at a pause, one of those horrendous silent moments, somebody yelled out, "Come on, Cicero, get going." And Silver Jack hadn't known who he was fighting, but Paulette's reputation was almost as great as his, apparently, because he turned around quickly and said, "Paulette Cicero," and that was the only thing that Paulette needed. Wham, he got him. And that's one version. Other version, Silver Jack took off. Silver Jack, Paulette Cicero, right back down to the boat. Third version that I like the most is when Paulette was coming down toward Silver Jack coming this way off the boat, and Paulette took one look at him and thought, this might be more than I care to handle. And while Jack was walking ominous, high noon, walking toward him, Paulette walked calmly over to the side of the street where there was, attached to a hitching post, as there were many in those days, a horse. Paulette walked over, small horse, walked over, put his hands under the horse, lifted it off the ground, and set it back down. And that was enough for Silver Jack, and he took off for the boat. Which was true, I don't know. All I know is Paulette Cicero was not beaten. Whether it was reputation that saved him or whether he actually pasted Silver Jack, don't know. But it still holds. Nobody has beaten Paulette Cicero to this day. I came across a little item. I gleaned the papers in the early 70s. We only have them from 71 through on. So from 71 on, I was going through every little item in our telephone. Well, I guess they didn't have phones till 1879. Well, what passed for the town talk of the day, the little items. Through all of them, trying to find Cicero notations. And I found several, but mostly about how he'd gotten some pinery out by Hubbard Lake and was cutting pine. Nothing about his fights, except then one day I did come across a little item with the headline across, "All from Gambling." So I read it, and sure enough, there was Paulette Cicero, big as life. It was the Alpena Argus for, I got it down, February 11th, 1873. I have to write those things down, I never remember. But I know it to be true because it was in the paper, and isn't everything in the paper always true, right? Well, there had been a card game at one of the local watering spots this night. A fellow by the name of James Wood and another fella from out of town, and they were not liking each other too well through this game, and tempers were really starting to show. Well, now Policeman Thompson, little fella, he was making his daily rounds or nightly rounds, I suppose, like they do now, making sure everything's locked up and stuff. And he popped his head in the saloon, see everything was cool, and he noticed in this card game that maybe that was going to be a fight. Well, he let it go for now. Went around another block or two, came back. By that time, their faces were getting pretty red. So Thompson went around the other block and came back, checked in. This time the fists were drawn, the chairs were back, and they were starting to get to their feet. And Thompson said, "This is it." And down the street he went to the sheriff's place, to wherever they kept Doug Scott. Don't know whether that would be down at the jailhouse or not. Don't know. But anyhow, Thompson went to get Doug Scott because he wasn't about to take on that saloon brawl by himself. While he was gone, it broke out for fair, and Cicero entered the place. And that's all Cicero needed, a fight already going. He just looked at him, picked sides, and started in. This time he took James Wood's place. By the time Policeman Thompson arrived back at the saloon with Marshal Doug Scott, the fight was full-blown. Cicero was handling it all. His friend Woods was under the pool table watching. And they was really flying, I'll tell you. Well, Marshal Doug Scott walked in the front door, took out his billy club. Don't think they use guns, really don't. Didn't usually have to. Took out his billy club and went up to Paulette and said, "You got to cut this out, Paulette," or words to that effect. And Paulette, same thing, words to that effect, said, "Go away, don't bother me." Scott kept after him, rapping him on the head every time he could get a lick in, you know. Finally, Paulette was getting a little annoyed, so he turned around and he picked Scott up. Just picked him up. Scott wasn't all that big, you know. And his feet were dangling there, and he was clopping Cicero on the head as hard as he could. Can't you see the picture? And proceeded to take him outside. But in the meantime, Policeman Thompson had come in from the back, and he was clouting Cicero on another part of his skull. And the Cicero was taking a pretty good shellacking, but he managed to get Scott outside. They, at that point, managed to overcome Paulette. I guess one more blow on the head did it, and got him handcuffed and took him off to the local lockup. That was one of the last fights that ever was recorded for Paulette. I really think that did it. From that day on, he was not himself. They put him in the jail, and he stayed quite peaceably. He was hurting, no doubt about it. His scalp was bleeding in several spots, and they called old Doc McTavish, and he came with his little black bag, but Paulette wouldn't let him near to bandage his head. He probably figured his head had been touched enough for one night, and so McTavish packed up his little black bag and went home. And the next morning, he was quite passive, Cicero was, and so Doug Scott said, "Okay, you can go home, feed the cows and stuff. You can go home, but you've got to report to Justice Doan's court at 10 o'clock. Okay, Paulette said he would. Shortly before 10 o'clock, he was seen coming out of his house there on 2nd Avenue with a gun in his hand, and that was unlike Paulette. So I think he'd really flipped at that point. He didn't carry sidearms at all, but he'd gotten a pistol, and he came out of the house brandishing it and made his way down to the bridge, close to the 2nd Avenue bridge. By that time, somebody had gotten Scott up. Scott had had a heavy night. He probably was sleeping in. But they got Scott down there, and Scott accosted Cicero and said, "Come on now, Paulette, this isn't like, give me the gun. Don't you come near me or I'll shoot." And I'm not playing around at all. Cicero made it very clear. He was mean, yet he was sober, which is what made me think that at this point he had flipped. He walked away, Cicero did, a couple of blocks down 2nd, turned on Chisholm and started toward the lake. And Scott right after him, with Cicero saying, "Don't come near me, I'll shoot the first man that touches me." And Scott managed to get next to him, and he turned around to talk to him, and Scott kept coming in the face of that gun. That took some doing, and backed Paulette into a lamp post, and just momentarily turned him, and that was the chance that he needed. Scott grabbed the gun. Paulette fired it, but it went right through this way and just caught Scott's sleeve. But once again, they hauled him in. And then there was nothing more about him. I could find nothing more about him except a very sort of poignant story in the Alpena, in the courthouse records. When I went up to look at the earliest records, these old handwritten, muchly fading now, earliest records we have, the book of births and marriages and deaths. And the very first notation was Paulette Cicero's death. He died Sunday, September 15th, 1878, and it says in the book, at the age of 45 years, 3 months and 8 days. And then the notation said, of softening of the brain, which I thought was very nice of them to put it that way, not to say how the brain got softened all through those years. Paulette, wherever he was, must have been very proud when that notation was made, because the final softening of his brain actually bent the billy club that was used. It was Scott again, and it was an oak burrow club, and he got clobbered so hard, the blow that killed him eventually, that it bent that club over. And that was a memento of the police department here for a number of years, and then it disappeared. Do we know what happened to that one, Bob? I know Chief Wilson had it for a long, long time, so I don't know what happened to it. I'd sure love to have that. I don't know why. Kind of gory, isn't it? But because I'm so fond of Paulette Cicero, undoubtedly there were many stories about him, but I think we ought to remember Paulette as being our local bad guy in a way, and yet not really entirely. Not the stereotype of the lumberjack of that early day, the epitome perhaps, but certainly symbolic of the toughness of the lumberjacks, of the people who built this town, the people who lived here, those early men. They don't make men like that anymore. Yet when you look at the pictures of them, I'm always so disappointed in the lumber display and all. You look at pictures of all these lumberjacks standing around on these huge loads of logs. They look moldy, slope-shouldered, funny mustaches. They really look but strong they were. That we know, and Paulette Cicero was the best of them. Those two things I wanted to talk about, those two men. There are others. We'll save those for another day. But in my looking around, this is old radio script, antique by now, I think. My Lord, the number of those I turned out, huh? Came across one that I thought you might get a kick out of to end up with. The city ordinances of 1883. You ready for this? It says in the city ordinances, I wonder if it still does. No, I think they rewrote that charter, didn't they, finally? My goodness, I hope so. It says it's against the law in 1883 for anybody in Alpena to take a bath between the hours of 4 in the morning and 9 in the evening. It's just what it says right there. It states that no person shall expose themselves within the city limits of Alpena for the purpose of bathing, and if they got caught doing that, they'd have to pay a $10 fine or spend 10 days in the lockup. Of course, the law referred to public bathing, I'm sure, at the beach and all, but it didn't say that. The way it's stated, you can't take a bath no place, in a tub or anything, In 1883, no drayman or person in charge of a conveyance, horse-drawn, naturally, what else would they have, that was moving along the street may leave his conveyance. I remember back in my little old town where I was a kid, the iceman would let the horse knew the route better than the iceman did, So he'd be hauling in the ice and the horse would go on to the next place all by himself and wait. The milkman did that too. Well, in Alpena that was against the law. And it said also that you must stick right close by it when it's not in motion, and furthermore, such draymen or drivers while waiting for employment shall not snap or flourish their whips or use any rude or boisterous talk or conversation to the annoyance of people who might be passing by. If you're thinking of building a sidewalk in front of your house back in 1883-84, there were a set of rules you had to go by to build your sidewalk. It had to be 6 feet wide, constructed of good sound pine or hemlock plank, not less than 2 inches thick and 12 inches wide, and laid on sleepers not less than 4 by 4 inches. They didn't want anybody breaking a leg, I suppose, because they'd get sued right down the line for that. Even in those days, malpractice, huh? And it had to be nailed with 40 penny nails. 40 penny nails in each plank with at least 2 nails in each bearing. Yes, sir. That was the old sidewalk of the day. Board sidewalks. How I'd love to see that again. Here's something else you had to remember if you lived in 1884. The city ordinance prescribed that if you're slaughtering any beeves or any sheep or other animals, I don't know what other animals it would be, in the city limits, when you slaughter them, you cannot allow the green or even the salted hide to sit on that sidewalk more than 1 hour. If you keep livestock in town, it is absolutely imperative, according to city ordinances, that you clean the yard every day. It's got to be kept cleaned up between the months of May and November. Now, what you did with it in the winter, it didn't matter, because in the wintertime it wouldn't smell anyhow, Now, if you're thinking of opening a place of business, a restaurant or something like that, you had to get a license and you had to pay for it according to what kind of a place you were opening. And so there had to be a set of rules for what kind of a place it was that you were opening. Now, if you're just going to provide food and lodgings for paying guests, you have, of course, a hotel. That won't cost you too much. If you provide food and lodging and liquor for your paying guests, then you've got a tavern, my friend. Now, if you sell food but no liquor, then it's a common victualling house. That'll cost you practically nothing. Now, if you sell food and liquor and tobacco, you know what you've got. You have got a saloon. That's going to cost you. It was that tobacco that did it. And food. You can also sell food. Then you can call it a tavern. Now, if you're going to open a place of business like that, a tavern where you sell liquor, it is absolutely against the law, according to 1883 ordinances, for you to have more than one or two at the outside, two pretty young girls waiting table. You can have all the old hags you want, but you can only have two pretty ones. I suppose the thinking there is that if you had 4 or 5, they would suspect you were running something other than a tavern, which you probably would have been doing, no doubt. Okay, I kind of cut you off last week when it came to questions. Anybody want to ask me anything particularly? I never know with groups like this how much you already know, about the history of Alpena. I don't want to bore people with details of when we got started and that we were a lumbering town. I assume that most of you know that. The other minor facts I kind of hope to bring out as we're going along. Oh, the jail I mentioned that we should talk about the jail. A lot of people may not know that we had 3 jails. 2 before the one we've got now. Yeah, 3 jails. And the first one, I discovered it all by myself. I was so proud of myself. The building, that is. No, I didn't discover it that way. I really had no speaking acquaintance with it. We had the kids, it was like a block party every time we moved out with that family, over to the Dairy Queen on Chisholm Street there, and while sitting in the car, which I always did with the wet wash rag ready, waiting for them to come back with the goo, I looked across the street, and there in what is now the parking lot of Dr. Fox's building there was this old building, the old Dunnan House. Do you remember it? The old gray Dunnan House, they called it then, on Chisholm Street. Falling Gate art house it was. Hadn't been painted in 100 years. But I noticed when I was sitting there gazing out on this hot day that there was a strange-looking bunch of holes in the windows. So I went across the street. I'm going to get picked up one of these days. I went across the street and I was going around this house looking up at those windows. Sure enough, in every window on the second floor there were this series of holes. And I couldn't figure that out. Should have been able to, but I couldn't, because I didn't even think about a jail in that vicinity, So I went home, called my source of all and everybody's information, Mr. Trelfa, and he said, sure, that was the county jail. They moved it. That had been the original county jail back in Paulette Cicero's day. This wooden house, and upstairs were the bars in the windows for the cells. And then when they built the stone jail, you all remember the stone jail? That was there on the right where the telephone booth is by Chisholm and 9th Street, where the new parking lot is, on Jesse Square, Market Square, okay? They moved it from there and built the old wooden one and built the new stone jail that was there when I came to town, till the 1950s, right, when they built the new one out here. So I felt like I found the jail. I was so proud of myself, But that had been the jail. That was the one they couldn't hold Cicero in, and I can see why. Okay, any questions that you want to ask me about Alpena? Can't guarantee an answer, but I'll try. Yeah.
But the fact that you studied all this past history, what do you think of this thing that was in the paper the other day about this lady talking about preachers?
I think she's missed this time. Don't you? Well, I think it's neat she won some money and that we got some publicity, although it's questionable in the National Enquirer whether that's good or bad. But her prediction about Jessie Besser Museum falling apart, you mean? Yeah, that tickled me. I wonder what she bases that on. Well, I don't know, though. We're sitting on an underground river right here.
Right.
Do y'all remember when this thing was built? Jessie was saying, build it up here in the clearing. He wanted, Besser wanted it up in the clearing, the site of the first Alpena, the Besser block machine, and that little clearing right before you get to the plant. But you know how quiet and soft-spoken he was. And the people, I don't know who they were, the architects, I guess, said, no, it's got to go here, right here. Well, any fool knows there's a river here. You just go across the street and look, the dry riverbed's there. You know, we're honeycombed with underground rivers, and this was one of the better ones. Sure, I think it took them a year to pump the basement out one here. Once they got it started, they hit that underground river immediately. So maybe there's more truth to poetry than poetry to her prediction. Maybe the rivers are going to rise again. No, I don't think so. I think she's really taken a flyer. She really lucked out on that last one. To me, I don't know, how'd you feel about it? I thought those predictions were awfully predictable. I mean, Groucho Marx had one foot on a banana peel and the other one in a grave anyhow. You know, he's been going to die for the last 5 years. I didn't think that was such a much. We were all up in arms about the nuclear waste burial. That was predictable. I didn't think there was anything really wild about her predictions. Well, I hope she's wrong this time.
You mentioned the ordinance about no public bathing. Could you say a little something about the public bathhouse? The mineral?
You mean the old magnetic sulfur spring? Well, if I do, I have to shoot one of my best stories. Because, see, I always tell the kids that the Stinky Spring, as we fondly refer to it, the well down there behind the library, I had fun with that thing once, that was the original salt well. Well, it wasn't, of course. The original one that they drilled for was down, about where Three Sisters is now, in that area, shopping center area. That was the first one. But instead of getting into all that complication, I just tell them it's the one that's there now, see, and that's why I say I hate to be brought up to task on this. Well, you mean the bathhouse, the maiden bathhouse that was built there. Doesn't everybody know that, about that? Stinky Spring? The well that's down there behind there's a fountain, I guess we call it a fountain, down behind the library. And that's there because in the early days, this one really was drilled in the 90s, but in the early days they were drilling around here for salt. That was the big thing. Salt was money. And of course there's salt under us, all over. One big salt deposit from the glacier times, you know, volcanic times. They were drilling down for salt. They would have taken oil if they'd hit it, but they really didn't care about oil, because who needed oil? What were you going to use it for? You know, grease up the wagon? There wasn't much to use oil for. But somebody thought it might be handy, possibly. It was a nuisance most places around here. It was trickling out of the fields and into the creeks. You know, there's oil here. I guess we're finding that out. But they wanted salt dearly, so they were drilling down. And if you can imagine the hardship of drilling in those days, and the first well they drilled was in the 1860s, 64, I think, strikes me. They took them a couple, 3 years, and they got down. The first thing they hit was this stinky water, the sulfur water. They hit the underground river, one of the many, and it blew the rig and everything, you know, came really tooting up out of there. Well, they capped it off, because who wanted stinky water? And they kept on going, and they didn't hit oil, but they did hit salt. They hit salt brine, and they thought that was going to be the big thing. Well, they had it really strong salt, boy. You know, they thought it would be a good salt well. See, they used to put water down to it then, and after they'd exhausted the water that was sitting in this little pocket down in the salt rock, pump it out, evaporate it off, introduce more water, pump it out, you know, salt brine, instead of going down and actually mining it. And they thought they really had something, and then when they introduced more water down to it and pumped it back out after a certain length of time, it came out just about as fresh as you could expect. There's something about the salt rock here in this county, apparently, Cal, am I wrong on this, that makes it impossible. It will not dissolve all that fast. Where are you, Loomis? There you are. Am I right about that?
I don't.
Well, Dewey talked about it in his geology, which I know you're familiar with. Apparently, it doesn't. There's something else in with the salt, the anhydride or something, that makes it impossible for it. It won't melt that fast. You know, you have to pump it down, sit and wait 50 years. It really wasn't worthwhile. So they were very disappointed. Well, they spent all this money drilling down, and the only real thing they got out was fake salt water and stinky sulfur water, egg water. But Fletcher knew how to make a bacalcuya, and he said, well, we ought to be able to do something with that. And he remembered there being a health spa with springs of mineral water down where, St. Louis, St. Joe, St. Louis, someplace down below. And there's one on Mount Clemens. There's a big one down there. I don't know whether that had started yet or not. But he thought that this water, from the smell of it, probably had the same qualities. So he sent it down to Professor Duffield at the University of Michigan, and he tested it out. Remember, this in the 1860s. And it turned out to be exactly the same mineral content, same combination and everything as these other health spas with their fountains in other parts of this neck of the woods. And furthermore, it had a slight electrical current to it, a slight charge to it. That's why they called it the magnetic sulfur spring. And it's possible there could be a chemical reaction between some of the chemicals in the water, I suppose, that caused this sort of tingling, you know. And it's supposed to be very therapeutic. Oh, it would cure anything. So Fletcher thought, well, I didn't get my salt, so I'll see what I can do with this. So he built the maiden bathhouse. Now this was really down where the shopping center is. The other one was built later. They tried again in the 1890s and built it, the bathhouse that you're all familiar with the pictures. I've used to be the Fletcher offices and the D&M offices, Alpena Business College, and most lately it was, before it burned, the county library. And it sat right where the library is today. But the first one was built, and they filled it with wooden bathtubs, and they pumped the water in. I hope they heated it first. God, it'd be terrible, taking a bath in that hot stuff. And people were supposed to come from all over, and that's why they built the Fletcher House, the big hotel where City Hall is. Come from all over to take the curative bath, stay at the Fletcher House and take the curative baths, but it never really quite worked out that way. Like I said last week, if they were that sick, they were too sick to, if they were sick enough to stand that bath water, they were too sick to make the trip. So it never really worked out too well. But there were 7 such wells, according to Professor Dewey, who is another character I would like to get into, and maybe we'll do that next week. 7 such flowing wells, they call them, in this town at one time. Incredible number of gallons of water being shot out of them. And some of them are still here. I think there's one over at Fletcher Paper Company they're still using, probably. There was one down behind the Ford garage that has been diverted into the river. There's a pipe sticking up on the beach behind Dr. Leopard's house, used to be the Tabor house, capped off, big pipe sticking up among the rocks, and that, my husband told me, was such a spring that was capped off. So wherever they drill down here, you got a danger of hitting that underground river, which is pure, or one of the many, pure sulfur water. But for a while, it looked like we'd be the health center of northern Michigan, but it didn't work out. But I said I had fun with that well, because when they were building the new library, all the plans, all the talk about the new library downtown, I got the kids in the Alpena History Hall head up. I wonder what they're going to do with our stinky spring, our fountain. I wonder if they're going to cap it off or what. Somebody better go down. So I sent a contingent of children down to, I like to make waves, down to the library, and he didn't know. He'd asked the board. And so he asked the library board. Well, they thought they'd cap it off. I mean, who wanted it? It's kind of a nuisance, sitting right where it does there. So when they built the new one, they thought they'd cap it off. But we suggested they better investigate that. We were going to protest. That's part of our history. You are not allowed to do that, We were going to have a big march with the signs, the whole thing. Peaceful protest, right? And in the meantime, they looked in the deed. Apparently the library board did. And they found out that the deed that Grace King Gilchrist Fletcher, Grace Gilchrist Fletcher, the deed in which she gave that land to the city, that half a block, said that in the first place it said this must always be park or library, and if you build the library someplace else, this must remain a park, but that library must be named the George and Fletcher Library. They're going to get the old boy commemorated there. And secondly, that if the spring, so long as it flows, be purposefully stopped or capped off. The property will immediately revert to the Fletcher family. And we thought that would be a riot. After they get the library built, then go down and tell them about it. You know, okay, you guys, what are you going to do with your library now? You know, get that spring back. So they did leave the spring, as you know. I thought it would have been kind of neat if they'd have sort of incorporated it into a garden room or something, you know. Well, we're going to have to protest again come spring, because the pipe's worn out and the darn thing isn't flowing, and they better fix it. Or we'll take the land back and give it back to the Fletchers.
And wasn't there a big resort somewhat tied in with that out on the North Shore?
I don't know.
Huron Beach,
I don't think it was tied in with that, was it?
someplace, why don't it?
It was a country
It was
club.
about the same time, but I understood they had a spring.
Well, could be, because almost any place you wanted to drill a well, that's what you got. That was the country club, the Huron Club. I guess you can still see the foundations of that.
I meant out farther, at what's now Huron Beach was for a while. Boy
That's the
Scout.
one I mean. I think so. Had a gazebo out in back, and they went by boat, and they spent the day there. There's no way to get there. And they would spend the day there. It was for the rich folks in town. It was quite the posh place. Yes, we have pictures of that. There are pictures of that. And another beautiful one out at Long Lake, of course, the country club at Long Lake. That is now long gone, but you can see the remnants of that, too. Yep. Is that what you want to know about this? Oh, you know all about this stuff. What are you putting me on for here? Mr. Lingus is going to bring us his slides 2 Sundays from now, and then I'll bait him. Yeah.
Did you ever hear about the 4 salt wells that they had right south of Harrisville? Was that Woodville?
Well, I've heard of them in Tawas, of course.
There were 4 there on account of the lumber mill. They had plenty of wood chips and one thing or another, and they refined the salt there, and they had 4 wells.
Yes, and oftentimes the salt business and the lumber business went hand in hand because of that. One of the biggest bugaboos they had in the lumber business is what to do with all the junk. They didn't have Abitibi then. What to do with all the sawdust and shavings and stuff, you know. And they would have to burn them, and that burned the town down a few times, too, in their efforts. And if they could use that burning process to get rid of their garbage and at the same time use the burning to evaporate salt water, so much the better. So frequently the two went together, definitely, but it didn't work out here quite to that point.
Was that the closest salt well?
As far as I know, yeah, Tawas and a little farther north. And I think they might have had some up north, maybe even in the upper, because it's all the same salt ledge, you know, that they're actually mining in Detroit. But we apparently had trouble here with our salt. It's that salt rock that's buying us the nuclear waste disposal, isn't it? Yeah, well, it's there. Nothing we can do about it. So, well, okay, isn't there something going on in the planetarium shortly for some of you? My watch seems to have stopped. Well, that one says 4:15. Yeah. And I'll see you next week. Oh, thank you.
You were listening to Ann Tabor talk about Alpena's history, recorded February 5th, 1978.